current pandemic, how it's impacting business, and what government's trying to do in order to support business through these unprecedented and challenging times. I must point out, when we first started speaking with your organization and with Scott, we were talking about some lobby initiatives that were focused on the fall, both federally and provincially, for the benefit of your organization and your members. And then suddenly this popped up, and who would have expected it to have such an impact on the overall economy and all your individual businesses. So we put together a deck of information. Some of it, depending on the amount of time you've been following the news, may seem obvious to you. But what we find is these presentations will generate a lot of thought, a lot of discussions, potentially either at the conclusion of my remarks or afterwards, and we're happy to do our best to provide some detail and some answers on that. Just to clarify, we're a government relations and advocacy firm. We help organizations like FIC with their messaging to government to ensure that people in government are hearing where your priorities are, and hopefully introduce legislation and introduce support measures that are going to benefit your members. We're not lawyers, we're not labor lawyers, we're not accountants, although we have some knowledge of both areas. But when it comes to those specific fields, we defer to your professionals that you work with in that capacity. So let's get started. Moving on to slide 2, everyone can see that, just making sure it works. About the Canadian economy. Okay, so the purpose of this slide was to take a step back and look at as recently as December, which was only a few months ago, and where the federal government thought they were heading in 2020. And Canada, as you know, is an economy part of the G7 or G8. And comparatively speaking, we were doing very well. We were entering a period of slow economic growth, but jobs were being created. Businesses were recording higher than average after-tax profits. The debt to GDP ratio was the lowest in the G7. And while the current government just won a minority last fall, they were looking forward to what they anticipated to be a fairly stable year ahead. Minority governments are always under the threat of a snap election and potentially a change in power. But things looked pretty stable for the most part. A new NAFTA agreement signed with the US. It looked as if that they could come in on a relatively normal year. And their deficit projection in December was $26 billion, a number that we'll come back to a little bit later. They were hoping to bring that down to $11.6 billion in 2024-25. And then this thing called coronavirus hits. We all heard about it starting in late last year out of China. For the most part, up until probably March, it seemed like an issue, a concern, a disease that was mostly going to affect other parts of the world, as these have in the past. No one anticipated the significant growth of this, the exponential growth around the world, and then the impact it's been having to governments and general economies and society. And it was identified in only in March 11th by the World Health Organization as the pandemic now everyone knows it as. So looking at a quick timeline, I put this in, we'd elected to sort of summarize this because governments, as you probably know, don't typically act very quickly. They're responsible for things that the public sector and governments have to be responsible for. And usually turnarounds and initiatives and spending initiatives take quite some time, but things have really unfolded very quickly here. From the first case in Canada and Ontario, January 25th, to where we are today, and in the last week or two, when you're seeing daily announcements, not only by the Prime Minister, but by premiers across the country and mayors in major cities, all announcing different initiatives around spending, where they want to allocate funds, to now we're starting to hear increasingly around mandated requirements for people to stay isolated and not be traveling anywhere. And we just heard today in Ontario, the Ontario Premier Doug Ford was very transparent with numbers that were shared to him from his medical experts around worst case projections. It was just announced in the last hour. They're anticipating on the current trajectory 1,600 casualties as a result of COVID-19, with a worst case scenario of 6,000 in Ontario. So they're clearly trying to wake up those members of the public who are not yet, in their minds, taking this serious enough and still congregating in large groups, to ensure that we do our utmost over the next week or two, which by all accounts, health experts are indicating is the most critical period. The next slide just points to unemployment. And we knew, as I mentioned in one of the initial slides, that unemployment was in a historical lows. I believe it was around 5% in December. This goes all the way back to the 80s. And for those of you that are old enough to remember the recessions in the early 80s and early 90s when we had unemployment rates in double digits, it's never been that high since. But now, speaking to people that I know directly in government, they're all forecasting, and this was reported recently, that they're anticipating the unemployment rate to be at 15% by the end of the year. Personally, I think it'll be higher than that. The hope is that the rebound will be quicker as well, but we just don't know. And going back to that deficit number, expectations that the federal deficit will be well over $100 billion this year from what they hoped would have been a $24 billion number that they were looking at in December. So now we just go into announcements. And as mentioned, there's been several announcements over the last few weeks. Repeatedly, the Prime Minister and the government have recognized that initial allocations of funds were probably not enough. This slide just shows you the opening announcement of $1.1 billion that was announced on March 11th. It's important to point out that very rarely outside of budgets do you see government stepping up and announcing immediate expenditures of $1 billion or more, at least in Canada. And that seemed like a lot of money at the time. It was. You can see that the majority of those funds were allocated to provincial and territory governments for support, mostly in the medical front lines, as well as a significant chunk of money for research. On this announcement in early March, there was no indication or allocation of funds to help individual Canadians or businesses yet, because at the time they just didn't anticipate this shutdown being mandated. Fast forward to a week later on the 18th is when they made their first announcement of $27 billion to support Canadian workers and businesses. And all of this information you can look in more detail on the government website. We provided hyperlinks on the bottom. But it was principally wrapped up in the emergency care benefits, higher GST rebates, extra money for parents with families, and the 10% wage subsidy that was originally introduced, allowing employers to essentially credit the equivalent amount off their deductions payable next month. That's since and subsequently been supplemented with a larger increase, which I'll get to in a minute. So that $27 billion was announced on the 18th. In addition, there was reference to $55 billion, which really wasn't any funding. It was simply a deferral of taxes, extensions of filing dates, including HST payments that were announced, extensions of both personal and corporate filing and payment of taxes owed until the fall. So, you know, they talked about it being an $82 billion investment. It was really $27 billion in cash and $55 billion in tax deferrals. If we move on, this is some additional measures that they introduced in terms of credit, making credit available through the Business Development Bank of Canada and Export Development Canada. A lot of this money in terms of small business is not something that you're likely going to be trying to get access to. Both those public corporations are set up for business expansion, business growth, export markets. The government is trying to find channels in which they can provide funds because they're not directly in the banking business other than through BDC. But that's why you've heard increasing commentary in the last week or so about collaboration and partnership with the major banks, including the funds that they announced just late last week. So principally, those announcements were centered around two areas. One of them individually to Canadians, and that has been the government's primary focus, both federally and provincially. So they announced temporary support for workers and parents, long-term support for workers, income support in terms of the new benefits that are coming forward, the flexibility for taxpayers as mentioned, the partnership with financial institutions, and as you've also seen, mortgage default management tools. So trying to give Canadians as much as possible opportunities to defer payments and keep the lights on, keep the food in the fridge, and keep the basics covered. I know from a business standpoint, you want to talk, we have a lot of interest about rent payments payable to your landlords. We'll get to that in a minute. I just wanted to cover first the two sort of primary areas of focus that the government was announcing. And secondly, with respects to business, as I mentioned, they have seen the number of people registering for EI skyrocket last week so high. It was the principal reason why the government chose to move the 10% wage subsidy up to 75%. Again, speaking to some direct context in business, they looked at it and they said, you know, unemployment is supposed to pay 55%, I believe, maximum earnings up to a cap. When you add in the admin cost of government to process all that, they were quickly getting to 75%. And they said, you know, it's just going to be quicker if we can move everyone over to this and try and encourage employers wherever possible to keep whatever number of their employees on the payroll that they can by giving them this larger subsidy. So we'll get to some more details on that in a minute. In addition to, as I mentioned earlier, government being able to file, or sorry, industry and business being able to file taxes later, trying to do more in terms of providing credit. And you heard reference last week to the up to $40,000 interest-free loans that'll be made available to business through the banks. Details still forthcoming somewhat on that, just to keep more money out there in the market. All of this information is available on their website, as mentioned down below. With respects to the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, you probably heard about this. This is topping up people that can prove that they've been out of work or not allowed to work because of what they do, their profession or their job or their employer, giving them up to $500 a week, $2,000 a month for 4 months. And this application is open. Anyone that has already registered for EI in the first 2 weeks, your application is going to be directly moved over to this, which the checks are I believe are starting to be rolling through pretty quickly next week, hopefully the week after at the latest, April 6th, I guess they're targeting there. And they expect a flood more of those coming in. The Canada Emergency Response Benefit information is all on their website. And we encourage people to be checking that regularly. If you're concerned about staff members or people that you have working for your businesses, they should be registering for this if they haven't already, if they meet the criteria. In terms of the wage subsidy, the 75%, been a lot of coverage on that. I just wanted to clarify that the 10% amount that was originally announced earlier on in March still stands for any and all businesses, and that is purely just a reduction on your deductions that are eligible the month following. So, for example, your payroll deductions are always due on the 15th. The next one being April 15th for the month of March. You should still be calculating that if you have any employees, including owners, principals that are on the payroll. That can just be credited off your deduction. If you have staff members that you're looking to make the application for the larger subsidy, the government will be cross-checking and deducting that 10% if in fact you've already claimed that, and then paying you back the difference. So it's open to all businesses regardless of size, charities, not-for-profits. You have to show a minimum of 30% reduction in revenue for March, April, and May, which I guess is no problem for those of you that have been forced to shut down. Governments have been pretty clear that they're going to be following up on audits on this. There's a lot of fear that people will be taking advantage of this with fake claims, and they really want to see employers keeping their employees on board and doing their utmost to pay the 25%. So I know some businesses are keeping all their managers and assistant managers and laying off their hourly staff members. Again, it comes down to an individual case-by-case basis. The subsidy is at a maximum $847, which I think works out to somewhere around an annual salary of $58,000. So if you have anyone on payroll that's making more than that, that's the maximum you can claim. The audits that I said, and then the payments will be hopefully 3 to 6 weeks away as per the announcement on Tuesday from the finance minister, and this is retroactive back to March 15th. In terms of rent support, rent relief, and I know that's been a pressing issue for your organization and your members, this is not a federal initiative. As you know, this rent controls and rent legislation is overseen by the individual provinces. There has been increasing talk about this. More talk on individuals' household rent, where their homes are, than there has been on commercial rent. This is an article I found on the Financial Post that talked about that. There seems to be, from a business category and sector standpoint, a lot of discussion on restaurants. I know that FIC put out a release earlier this week that we helped them on with respects to the impact to your industry and how gyms could close and what the social consequence with that would be. I noticed that Premier Ford made a statement yesterday in Ontario speaking specifically of restaurants and saying how upset he was of seeing a lot of those family-run businesses close down, but he more or less admitted that the provincial treasury didn't have the capacity currently to help them. And he begged and pleaded for landlords to try and work with their tenants and ensure that we're all in this together. So we're going to keep an eye on this. I know that BC made some announcements. Their premier as well said that there needs to be collaboration between landlords and tenants and to all get through this together. But currently, we have not seen any commitments from any government in terms of stepping up and providing direct relief for rents. I would imagine that commercial landlords are also equally appealing to government for support on this, because they will have their fixed costs as well in terms of running and owning buildings and properties. In terms of things you should do, there was a list last week on the Canadian Chamber of Commerce website, and it was things like make sure your contingency plan and be prepared for disruption in your business. I think that's rather evident now. There's obviously been massive disruptions in business at all levels across the country. So these are 4 steps that we recommend you come up with or you follow through if you haven't done so already. And number 1, I know that the vast majority of businesses and individuals are registered on with CRA online. If you haven't done that, do that right away. It expedites any applications, and also government then can transfer money directly into your bank account. You don't want to rely on the mail these days. So I encourage not only business owners, but individuals to go online to CRA and ensure that your online account is active and working. Number 2, and we say this to all the organizations we work with, collaborate as much as possible with your association on messaging. I know that those of you on the call today and the diversity of members you likely have across the country, circumstances may differ greatly in terms of communities on where you're based, rental agreements that you have, and just the size of the businesses. But fundamentally, you want to focus on the same messaging, particularly when you're speaking to elected officials or members of the media. This is a very, very busy sort of crowded landscape with messaging coming to government from all different parties and organizations. And if we're going to have breakthrough on the messaging that's important to your organization, we got to be consistent with that. And we'll certainly work with FIC to ensure that you're provided the necessary information. I encourage you to reach out to your member of provincial parliament or your MLA or your MP. As mentioned, the issue on rent control is mostly provincial. So if you haven't met your member of provincial parliament or your member of legislative assembly, find out who they are, reach out to them, send them a letter, tell them who you are, the investments you've made in your business, the importance of ensuring that places like gyms and fitness clubs and fitness professionals are recognized for the important role you play, particularly considering the, I heard someone joke about the COVID-19, 19 extra pounds we're all going to be putting on in this period of isolation, and just the mental health challenges that we're all going to be facing. And it's proven, obviously, that fitness plays a big role in that because you're an important part of local communities across the country. So reach out to them, get to know them, write them a letter. If we have a letter writing campaign, I'm sure that we'll be able to provide templates to everyone in terms of that standard messaging going forward. And lastly, just communicate, communicate, communicate. We help a lot of organizations do that. I suspect many of you have already had conversations with your staff, with your management teams, with your partners. You need to keep those communication lines going. It's interesting to see how someone like Premier Ford, who didn't have necessarily a good track record going into this since he won power a couple of years ago, being heralded by critics and friends alike for at least being honest and consistent and regularly available, and similar to the Prime Minister as well. These daily updates and bits of information are very important. So you want to keep that going at this time. And with your members, I'm sure, I know that I've gotten a few emails from my gym telling me what they're doing in this challenging time. Chris, are you able to talk? Can you hear me?
You know what? I believe Chris was muted, but Chris, if you can hear us, you can actually unmute yourself.
I was going to get him to weigh in on this because he's the expert on stuff in Ottawa, but let's see if I can get him. Are you there, Chris? No? Well, I'll jump in here, and then if he can unmute himself, he can add in as well. But we put a summary on what's next. The regular schedules of both the House of Commons and provincial legislatures have been suspended and changed. The current estimated date for the federal government to resume sitting is on April the 20th. They have had a couple of emergency sessions where they've invited a skeleton number of people there to maintain the appropriate social distancing within the House, to pass necessary legislation. And while they are a minority government and things tend to be more difficult when you're a minority, there's no opposition from the opposition parties in terms of getting these measures passed and ensuring that funds flow to Canadians as fast as possible. The budget was set originally for March 30th. That's been postponed indefinitely, and we don't anticipate the government even having a handle on how much money they're going to be spending until at least the peak of this crisis is behind us. So probably summer, most likely even the fall, before a formal budget is presented. Many organizations have been communicating with governments. You just have to open up the local paper or the national paper or Google online and to see what new group is bebeing impacted. This comes down to the challenge of advocacy, because you folks and it's impacting you first and foremost, but we know that other industries, and particularly the tourism and industry, which hit hard right out of the gate, airlines, everything else, they're all communicating with government as well. So that's why, as per my statement earlier, really critical that everyone within your organization is communicating on a similar messaging so that it can start to resonate and government can at least consider the opportunities and how they can best help you. The House of Commons Finance and Health Committees are meeting virtually to discuss these impacts. There was an announcement just yesterday from the Finance Committee. Well, they'll be hearing from witnesses from different organizations. You know that the list of requests to present to them will be much longer than they can accommodate. We keep our eyes open for these opportunities and certainly share them with Scott and Tricia as they come up. Just getting there, presenting when possible. And governments also have been extending social distancing rules. Some indication of these could extend to July. I find that overwhelmingly depressing, but we'll have to wait and see. I think they're really working hard to convince the majority of Canadians to understand the severity of this and to ensure that we take it seriously in the short term, and better to give you know, some good news later if in fact this can be lifted. And in terms of what's next, as I said before, the opposition parties will put some pressure on government, but you're not likely going to see them stall anything. The criticism from the public would just be so significant, it's not worth it. You're going to see more stimulus packages from government in various sectors. You're going to see increasing partnership with the private sector, not only in manufacturing items for frontline healthcare workers, but the government can't do it all on their own. So they're going to be working with industry across the board to try and see how they can fight this collaboratively most effectively. They're going to sit through the summer months. I think a lot of things are going to be pushed back through the summer, including school and education schedules. But lobbying is going to, you know, opportunities to continue to push your message through. Normally when summer comes, those get suspended or at least slow down. We anticipate they're going to ramp up through the summer, looking into when we can get back to a normal legislative session in the fall. The opposition Conservatives have a leadership race going on. It's been suspended, likely to defer until later on in the year. Peter MacKay is someone well known, and he remains the front runner in that race. We're keeping our eyes open in that. We mentioned that from a standpoint, while the focus is solely on the government, this will end at some point. The world will come back to some sense of normalcy. And as I mentioned before, the Liberals are in a minority situation. An election could be triggered. Who is the other party person that could be in a position of power? And if there's opportunities to communicate your concerns and issues to opposition members at the appropriate time, we certainly want to take advantage of that. And the last thing, there's been numerous references to the Emergencies Act. It was formerly called the War Measures Act in Canada, only ever enacted 3 times. The government has hinted at the possibility of passing this measure. It essentially gives them unprecedented power and control without having to go to Parliament for everything. They don't do this lightly. I know they would prefer not to do this. If they do, it would only be likely in a desire to continue to try and encourage Canadians to be self-quarantined. And if they see issues of, civil unrest, I don't see that happening, but there is some continued chatter on that. We'll have to wait and see. In terms of resources, there's lots of information out there. We can't stress enough. The government's been doing a very good job at ensuring that their portals are up to date and their applications are up to date. When Finance Minister Morneau announced the most recent 75% wage subsidy earlier this week, he did say that they were working on the website and that they were going to do their best to get it up. I believe the portal will be up next week. So this is something that government admits usually takes them months. So they're being pushed here to do as much as possible. We've consolidated what we believe is the best resources on our website, grassrootspa.ca. There's a link at the top you can check out, but we've provided all of these and we'll send the deck over that you can share. All of these are hyperlinked. You can go there for information. A lot of good information from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce and the Canadian Federation of Independent Business as well. So that's generally my presentation. Lots of information there. I suspect there may be questions. We'll do our best to answer them or at least point you in the right direction. Is that okay, Tricia?